When was the last time you truly heard your own voice beneath the noise of the world? Every day we are pulled in countless directions by expectations, ambitions, fears, and endless distractions. We become so busy trying to be someone that we forget who we already are. This audiobook is an invitation to stop, to look inward, to rediscover the quiet place within you that has been waiting patiently all along. Take a deep breath. Let the outside world fade into the background and join me on a journey back to yourself. Return to yourself, the depth of presence. The city had not truly slept for a long time. Even at night it pulsed beneath the skin of neon lights, signals, messages, and conversations carried on without presence. People passed one another in the streets, with faces illuminated by the cold glow of their phones, as if each carried in their hands a small fragment of the world that simultaneously offered a sense of connection and deepened their loneliness. It was November. A wet, heavy November that smelled of rain and exhaust fumes. In one of the apartments on the 9th floor sat a man. He had no name because he could have been anyone, perhaps you. He sat by the window with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold and looked out at the city lights. Every few seconds, the phone screen lit up with a new notification. Someone replied. Someone liked something. Someone wanted something. But beneath all of it, there was something else. Fatigue. Not the ordinary kind that disappears after sleep. Deeper, older. The kind that cannot be slept away. Sometimes a person wakes up in the morning and from the very first second feels the weight of their own existence. Nothing dramatic has happened. Life goes on. Everything functions. Yet something inside resembles an abandoned house. The man closed his eyes, and then he heard silence. Not true silence, the kind that appears between one noise and another. A brief crack through which for a moment you can see yourself. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then the world returned. Notifications, thoughts, plans, fears. Modern man no longer lives in the world. He lives in a constant reaction to the world. From morning until evening, something calls to him. Something wants something from him. Something evaluates his worth. Numbers, results, productivity, attractiveness, success, speed. Modernity has created a religion of constantly becoming someone other than who you are now. And yet the greatest tragedy of a human being rarely lies in not achieving enough. The greatest tragedy is spending an entire life without ever meeting oneself. Carl Gustav Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Yet most people never reach that place. They die exhausted by the roles they played, by smiles they never felt, by ambitions that were never truly their own. From childhood we learn to cut ourselves off from ourselves. Don't cry, don't exaggerate, be strong. You have to manage. What will people say? And so little by little, a person is born who knows how to function but no longer knows how to feel. The world rewards this amputation. The less of yourself you show, the easier it is to be accepted. The more you ignore your own emotions, the more mature you appear. The faster you run, the more important you seem. No one notices the moment they begin living against themselves. It happens quietly. First you stop listening to your exhaustion. Then you ignore your sadness. Then you no longer know what you truly want. Until one day you stand in front of a shelf of coffee in a store or stare out the window of a bus, and suddenly a strange question reaches you. Who am I really when no one is watching? That question can be more frightening than loneliness, because most people know themselves only as a reflection of other people's expectations. Alan Watts wrote that a human being is something like an actor who has identified with the role so completely that he has forgotten he is acting. And perhaps that is why we are so terrified of stopping, because in silence, all the constructions begin to crack. One night the man left his apartment without any destination. The city was damp from the rain. Streetlights reflected in the sidewalks like blurred memories. He passed a closed bakery, a bus stop, and a park where the trees looked like silent witnesses to human haste. He sat on a bench, without a phone, without music, without distraction. And suddenly he felt something uncomfortable. Himself. Not his successes. Not the story about himself, not his photographs, not other people's opinions, himself. It was almost a physical experience. As if after years of noise, he had heard a quiet voice rising from beneath ruins. Many people think being lost looks dramatic. It does not. Most often it looks very ordinary. It looks like a person who smiles every day but has not truly felt anything for a long time. Like a woman who achieved everything, and yet sits in silence every evening without knowing why she feels sad. Like a father who no longer remembers the last time he breathed peacefully. Like a young boy scrolling through his phone at 2 in the morning because he is afraid to be alone with his thoughts. The world has taught us to run from ourselves with extraordinary efficiency. Pain is no longer even necessary to disconnect. A screen is enough. A television series, work, shopping, a conversation without presence, constant movement. A person begins to resemble their own shadow. They function, react, complete tasks, but somewhere along the way they lose contact with life. And life does not happen in haste. Life happens in those barely noticeable moments, in a breath at dawn, in the silence of an empty apartment, in the trembling of hands during an honest conversation, in a glance that needs no explanation. Thich Nhat Hanh said that the greatest miracle is not walking on water, but walking on the earth with full presence. But presence requires courage, because when you truly stop, you will not see only beauty, you will also see your pain, your fear, your loneliness. The entire life you never truly lived, and perhaps that is why so many people choose noise. Noise asks no questions. Silence, meanwhile, looks directly into a person. The man sat on the bench for a very long time. Rain settled gently on the sleeves of his coat. Somewhere in the distance the last tram passed. And then something extraordinarily simple happened. For the first time in many years, he was not trying to be anyone. He did not have to prove anything. He did not have to achieve anything. He did not have to become a better version of himself. He simply was. For a brief moment he felt something he could not name, perhaps relief, perhaps sadness, perhaps truth. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "The quietest words bring the storm. Sometimes one true encounter with yourself can shatter an entire life built on illusion. But that is exactly where the return begins. Not when a person finds all the answers, but when, for the first time in a very long while, they dare to hear their own voice beneath the layers of the world. That voice does not shout. It never shouts. It is more like a barely perceptible vibration somewhere deep beneath everyday life. A quiet whisper, reminding us that beneath all the roles, there is still someone real. Someone tired of pretending. Someone who wants to come home, to themselves. The greatest noise in the world does not come from the streets. It is not born in car engines, advertisements, news broadcasts, or crowds squeezing through crosswalks. The greatest noise is carried within a person. It is the endless stream of thoughts, memories, fantasies, fears, and conversations conducted inside one's own mind. Modern people almost never experience true silence. Even when they are quiet, something inside them continues to scream. That is why so many fall asleep with the television on. That is why they drive with the music turned slightly too loud. That is why they instinctively reach for their phones during every empty moment. Silence has begun to resemble a dark room that we are afraid to enter alone. A woman sat in her kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning. The small apartment was quiet, and the world beyond the window looked as if it had ceased to exist for a moment. The refrigerator produced a monotonous hum. Somewhere far away, a dog barked. A cup of tea sat in front of her, long since abandoned. That evening, for the first time in months, she had not turned on a television series. She had not opened social media. She had not called anyone. She simply sat there. And that was when something began, the very thing she had been running from for years. First came unease, gentle but unmistakable, as if a quiet current were moving beneath her skin. Then came the thoughts, one after another, unfinished conversations, old mistakes, memories of people she had lost, the face of her father standing in a doorway many years ago, the grief she had never truly allowed herself to feel. Suddenly she understood something painful. For most of her life she had been busy running from herself. People are not afraid of silence because it is empty. We fear it because it is full. In silence, everything we have drowned out for years rises to the surface. Longing, regret, a sense of incompleteness, fear of passing time, loneliness that does not disappear even when surrounded by others. Blaise Pascal once wrote that most of humanity's problems come from its inability to sit quietly alone in a room. Centuries have passed, and those words have become even more true. Modern life has turned distraction into a lifestyle. People almost no longer exist without stimulation. They need something constantly occupying their attention because every empty moment begins to resemble an encounter with something unknown. Yet that unknown thing is themselves. A Zen monk once said, "When you are lonely and feel lonely, you are in bad company." The sentence sounds harsh until its meaning becomes clear. Most people have never truly learned how to be with themselves. We do not know how to sit in the silence of our own existence without wanting to escape. We do not know how to breathe without feeling compelled to do something. Even rest has become something that must be used productively. The woman remained motionless. Time moved differently than usual, slower, deeper, as if the night itself had expanded the space between one thought and another. Then something strange happened. Beneath all that anxiety, she discovered immense exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, existential exhaustion. The exhaustion of constantly being strong, constantly explaining herself to the world, constantly adapting. She realized that no one had truly asked her how she felt for a very long time, yet what hurt even more was the realization that she had not asked herself either. Silence has a remarkable quality. It adds nothing, it only reveals. That is why someone who has built an entire identity upon movement and noise can feel lost within it. Suddenly, there is nowhere left to run, nothing left to cover the emptiness, no new goal capable of numbing existence for a little while. Only breath remains, the present moment, and the truth. Many people confuse loneliness with silence. They are not the same thing. Loneliness hurts when we are running from ourselves. Silence begins to heal only when we stop fighting our own inner world. That is why some people can sit alone beside a lake and feel completely alive, while others fill every second with conversations, music, and the presence of others and still feel empty. A person can be surrounded by people and yet remain entirely abandoned by themselves. Dawn was beginning to brighten the windows. The woman noticed that she was breathing more calmly than she had in a long time, not because her problems had been solved. Nothing had changed. She still carried the same fears, the same questions, the same life. Yet something had shifted, as though after years of constant running she had finally sat down beside her own soul and allowed it to speak. People often imagine awakening as something spectacular, a flash of light, a great transformation, a mystical experience. Yet true awakening is often very quiet. Sometimes it looks like a person sitting alone in a kitchen before sunrise, like a breath that suddenly becomes noticeable, like the moment when, for the first time in years, you stop running from your own emotions. Carl Jung believed that what we refuse to experience consciously returns to us as fate. Perhaps that is why silence is so important. Only within it do we begin to hear what had previously been trying to speak through fear, tension, insomnia, and sadness. The body whispers before it starts to scream. The soul does the same. The problem is that modern people listen only when suffering becomes unbearable. Yet the inner voice never disappears. It remains beneath everything, beneath every conversation, beneath every ambition, beneath every success, waiting patiently, like light beneath the door of a closed room. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote that silence is as essential to human beings as air. Without it, we stop seeing life as it truly is. In noise, it is easy to forget about impermanence, about fragility, about the fact that everything we chase will one day disappear. Silence reminds us of fundamental things: breath, presence, death. Yet paradoxically, that is exactly why it restores life. The woman walked to the window. The sky was the color of cold ash. The first people were appearing in the streets. Someone hurried along with their head lowered. Someone smoked a cigarette on a balcony. Someone began another day without a single moment of meeting themselves. and suddenly she felt immense tenderness toward all of them, because she understood that most of them were simply very tired, tired of pretending, tired of struggling, tired of trying to be someone sufficient. Perhaps that is why we need silence so deeply, not to become better, but finally to stop running from ourselves. Silence does not repair a person. Silence reminds them that they were never broken. Beneath all the layers of fear, tension, and chaos, there is still something untouched, something peaceful, something true, and perhaps an entire life is nothing more than a journey back to that place. A person rarely sees the world as it truly is. Most often they see it as their own fear suggests it is. Ego is not a monster. It is not something evil. It is more like a frightened child that spends its entire life trying to make sure it deserves love and a place in the world. The problem begins when that voice takes control of the whole of existence. Then a person stops living and begins endlessly constructing themselves, building an image, a persona, a story about who they should be. One afternoon, a man sat in a crowded cafe. Around him, people talked about work, plans, travel, and money. Laughter mixed with the sound of cups and saucers. Everyone seemed to be playing some kind of role. Someone was trying to appear happy, someone confident, someone indifferent. He watched them and suddenly felt a strange sense of unreality, as if they were all participating in a performance whose meaning had long ago fallen apart, yet no one had the courage to leave the stage. Ego loves roles. It feeds on them. It needs them in order to exist. I am important. I am intelligent. I am better. I am worse. I am special. I am nobody. Even suffering can become part of an identity. Some people carry their pain for so long that without it, they would no longer know who they are. Alan Watts wrote that ego is the illusion of a separate self constantly struggling to survive in the world. A person believes they are an isolated island separated from the rest of existence, and so they dedicate their entire life to defending that island. They build walls from achievements, opinions, success, and control. Yet the higher the walls become, the lonelier they feel. The man observed a woman sitting at a nearby table. She smiled broadly while telling her friends a story, but her hands were tense. There was a fatigue in her eyes that could not be hidden. At one point she glanced at her phone screen and her face dimmed for a second. So briefly it was almost invisible. Then the smile returned. Ego is a master of survival. It can create an entire life built around avoiding the truth. A person can spend years playing the role of someone happy, strong, or fulfilled without realizing they are slowly drifting away from themselves. The most frightening part is that society rewards the performance. The more effectively you hide your inner chaos, the more put together you seem. The more successfully you suppress your emotions, the more professional you appear. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, many people are quietly falling apart. Ego fears one thing more than death: dissolution, the loss of control, the silence in which the story of who we are ceases to exist. That is why people so desperately need constant confirmation of their worth. They need recognition, likes, success, relationships, money, comparisons. They need something that will silence the inner hunger for a moment. But the hunger never disappears. Ego cannot be satisfied. It lives through lack. An old therapist once said to a patient, "You do not suffer because you are insufficient. You suffer because you have spent your whole life trying to become someone other than who you are." Those words stayed with the man for many months. He began noticing how often he acted out of fear of judgment, how many of his decisions were attempts to earn acceptance. Even kindness can sometimes be a mask of ego. Some people help others only to feel needed. Some love only when they are admired. Some sacrifice themselves because they fear rejection. Ego can even hide beneath spirituality. A person may meditate, read philosophers, and speak about consciousness while still building a subtle image of their own uniqueness. I am more awakened than others. I am more conscious. Ego loves such stories. It does not want truth. It wants survival. Eckhart Tolle wrote that ego feeds on time. It needs the past to build identity and the future to maintain the illusion of fulfillment. That is why it finds it so difficult to be truly present. The present moment is dangerous for ego because in complete presence, the story of me begins to weaken. What remains is the pure experience of life, without narrative, without defense, without performance. The man walked through the city that evening. A light rain was falling. People hurried past him, each enclosed within their own world. Suddenly he noticed an elderly man sitting at a bus stop. His face was calm. He was not looking at a phone. He was not doing anything at all. He simply sat there watching rainwater flow down the street. There was something extraordinary about him, a simplicity that needed to prove nothing. The man felt a sudden wave of emotion. He realized how exhausted he had become from constantly defending his own image, how much energy it takes to maintain the illusion of oneself. Because ego is not only pride, just as often it appears as a sense of inferiority. A person obsessively focused on their flaws is still focused on themselves. It is the same trap. I, me, mine. Yet life unfolds beyond that endless monologue. Carl Jung believed that until a person encounters their own shadow, they will mistake it for fate. Ego does not want to see its darker sides. It prefers to project them onto others. That is why judging comes so easily. People often hate most intensely in others what they cannot accept within themselves. Someone despises weakness because they fear their own. Someone mocks emotionality because they have learned to suppress their feelings. Someone obsessively controls others because chaos lives inside them. Ego creates a world of divisions. It separates people from one another, from nature and from life itself. It convinces them that they must constantly fight for their place, that worth must be earned, proven, won. Yet life does not ask about achievements when a person sits alone at night in an empty apartment feeling the weight of their own heart. In moments like that, all masks begin to crack. What remains is naked existence, fear, longing, truth. The man arrived home late. He did not turn on the light. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall. The apartment was dark and quiet. For a while he listened to his own breathing, and for the first time in a long while, he stopped trying to fix anything. He stopped trying to become a better version of himself. He stopped trying to control his thoughts. He simply watched them appear and disappear like waves. One said, "You are not enough." Another whispered, "You must try harder." A third asked, "What will happen next?" Then he noticed something extraordinary. If he could observe those thoughts, then he could not be them. The discovery was small, yet as profound as a crack appearing in the wall of a prison. Most people believe every thought that enters their minds. They treat their own minds as absolute truth. Yet the mind is often nothing more than an archive of fears, memories, and other people's voices. The true self exists deeper, quieter. It does not require constant confirmation of its worth. It does not compare itself. It does not fight for attention. It simply is. And perhaps that is why the journey back to oneself is not about adding more layers. It is not about becoming someone new. It is about slowly removing masks until a person finally meets the quiet presence hidden beneath all the noise of ego. That meeting is not spectacular. It often arrives in very ordinary ways. In the silence of a room, in the gaze of a stranger, in the exhaustion of one's own pretending, in the moment when a person no longer has the strength to keep running from themselves. And that is when something real can finally begin. The body never forgets. Memories can be drowned out. Emotions can be pushed away. A person can convince themselves that everything is fine, yet the body will remember anyway. It will speak through tension in the neck, sleeplessness, a racing breath, stomach pain before a conversation one fears, or a heaviness in the chest that appears for no obvious reason. Modern people live as if they are disconnected from their own bodies. They treat the body as a tool for completing tasks. It must function, it must be efficient, it must look good, it must not get in the way. Yet the body is far more than that. It is a living chronicle of everything a person has experienced and everything they were unable to fully experience. A woman stood beneath a shower with hot water running down her back. She was 37 years old and could no longer remember what true rest felt like. Even when she lay completely still, her body remained tense, as though it expected something bad to happen. Her shoulders were raised from constant stress. Her jaw clenched during sleep. Her breathing was shallow and quick. A doctor had once told her that all her results were good, that it was probably just exhaustion. But she felt it was something deeper. The body often begins speaking when the soul has been ignored for too long. Trauma rarely looks the way films portray it. It is not always a single dramatic event. Sometimes trauma is born over many years, in a home where there was no room for emotions, in a childhood filled with coldness, in constant tension, in being invisible. A person may grow up, find a job, build a family, and yet still carry within them a frightened child who never felt safe, and the body knows it. Bessel van der Kolk once wrote, "The body keeps the score." The sentence is simpler and more frightening than it first appears, because it means that nothing truly disappears. Every unspoken suffering leaves a trace. Every suppressed "I'm afraid," every swallowed no, every cry trapped in the throat. The human organism is like a forest after a fire. Even when life returns to the surface, the earth remembers the flames for a long time. The woman turned off the water and looked into the mirror fogged with steam. She had the feeling she was looking at a stranger. For a long time she had lived more in her head than in her body. Her thoughts constantly analyzed the future. Her heart was exhausted. And her body. Her body was like a loyal dog left alone in the rain. Quiet. Patient. Ignored. Modern people hardly feel their own bodies anymore. They do not notice their breathing. They do not notice tension. They do not notice fatigue until the organism begins to scream. That is why so many illnesses arise from prolonged disconnection from oneself. For years the body sends subtle signals, yet people have learned to ignore them. A headache, a pill, insomnia, another television series, anxiety, a phone, sadness, work. The world has taught us to function beyond our own limits, yet the body does not know how to lie. One may deceive other people, one may deceive one's own mind, but the body always tells the truth. It trembles when a person is afraid. It contracts in humiliation, it opens in love, it closes in danger. It reacts to things that consciousness often does not yet understand. One evening the woman lay down on the floor of her living room, not to meditate, not to improve herself. She was simply too exhausted to keep pretending she controlled everything. She lay motionless and, for the first time in a very long while, listened to her body. First she felt anxiety, then a pulsing sensation in her stomach, then a vast sadness hidden deep beneath her ribs. Suddenly, tears came. Quiet tears. Peaceful tears. She did not even know exactly why she was crying, or perhaps she did know, but had never before allowed herself to feel it. People often ask, why does the body react this way? But the real question is, how long did the body have to remain silent? A child who suppressed fear for years may grow into an adult burdened with chronic tension. Someone who had to be strong all their life may suddenly experience a strange exhaustion that no medical test can explain. The body remembers even when the mind forgets. Carl Jung believed that what is repressed does not disappear. It merely descends into the underground of the psyche. The body is one of the places through which that underground tries to communicate with a person. That is why an ordinary scent can suddenly trigger fear. That is why certain voices tighten the throat. That is why some looks create tension that is difficult to explain. Entire landscapes of memory exist within a human being, beyond the reach of words. Suddenly the woman remembered a scene from childhood. She was perhaps 8 years old. She stood in a hallway listening to her parents argue behind a closed door. She remembered her own breathing, the way she tried to stay quiet, the way her body froze completely still. That was when she first learned to tense her shoulders, and she never truly relaxed them again. People believe the past is gone, yet the past often continues to live in the way we breathe, in the reactions of the nervous system, in the tension of muscles. It lives in the way a person responds to closeness, conflict, silence, or rejection. Trauma does not always say, remember. Sometimes it says, survive. And that is why so many people live in a permanent survival mode. Even when no real danger remains, the body becomes accustomed to alarm. A person forgets what peace feels like. Some people feel anxious precisely when everything is going well. Silence seems suspicious. Rest creates guilt. Love awakens fear, because the body learned long ago that safety never lasts. It is tragic how many people spend their entire lives trying to earn the right to relax, even for a moment. Yet the organism does not need perfection. It needs safety. It needs presence. It needs a human being willing at last to listen. Thich Nhat Hanh said that breath is the bridge between the body and awareness. Yet most people breathe as though they are afraid of life itself. Quick breaths, short inhalations, endless tension, as if the organism never truly believed it was allowed to let go. The woman placed a hand on her chest. Her heart was beating more calmly than usual. Rain fell outside. The apartment was dark. And suddenly she felt something extraordinarily simple. Compassion for herself. Not analysis, not judgment. Not an attempt to fix anything. Pure compassion. As if for the first time, she saw how long she had carried her burden alone. It was the beginning of something important, because healing rarely begins with a dramatic breakthrough. More often it begins with a moment when a person stops fighting their pain and sits beside it in silence, without hurry, without shame, without the need for immediate change. The body does not need a perfect life. It needs truth. It needs gentleness. It needs a breath that is not an escape. The human organism is like an animal. It senses falsehood. It knows when something is forced. It knows when a person betrays themselves. And it also knows when, for the first time in a very long while, that person is returning home, to their own presence, to their own breath, to themselves. Every person carries within themselves a room they do not want to enter, a room without windows, locked somewhere deep beneath everyday life. It is where all emotions considered too uncomfortable, too shameful, or too painful to show the world are stored. Anger that was never allowed expression. Jealousy a person feels ashamed of. The need for closeness hidden beneath a mask of independence. Fear of rejection concealed behind coldness and distance. Carl Gustav Jung called this place the shadow. And perhaps there is nothing more frightening than meeting one's own shadow, because it requires seeing oneself without embellishment, without the narrative of one's goodness, without spiritual masks, without illusions. A man woke at 4 o'clock in the morning with a weight pressing against his chest. It was not ordinary anxiety. It felt older than that, as if beneath the surface of sleep, someone had quietly opened a door to a world he had spent years avoiding. The apartment was dark. Only the city lights seeped through the curtains, casting trembling shadows across the walls. He sat on the edge of the bed and felt a strange emptiness. Lately, he had increasingly sensed that something inside him was trying to rise to the surface, something uncomfortable, something he did not want to see. People often confuse growth with building a better version of themselves, yet true growth begins only when a person stops running from who they really are. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Most people are driven by forces they do not understand. They repeat the same patterns, enter similar relationships, sabotage their own happiness, react with disproportionate anger or overwhelming fear without knowing where it comes from. The shadow works quietly. The more a person tries to repress it, the more powerfully it influences their life. The man walked to the bathroom mirror and stared at his reflection for a long time. There was a fatigue in his face he had never noticed before. Suddenly he remembered a conversation from a few days earlier. A friend had said something that provoked an unexpectedly intense anger in him. For hours he had been convinced that the other man was at fault. But now in the silence of the night, he began to understand something uncomfortable. Those words hurt because they touched a place within himself that he did not accept. People very often judge others in the places where they themselves are most wounded. Someone obsessively criticizes weakness because they fear their own helplessness. Someone mocks emotionality because they learn to suppress their feelings. Someone despises another person's need for love because their own need for closeness feels humiliating. The shadow is not evil. It is everything that has been denied the right to exist. The problem is that what is repressed never disappears. It simply waits. Sometimes it appears in dreams. Sometimes in sudden emotional outbursts. Sometimes in toxic relationships. And sometimes in that strange feeling of emptiness, a person cannot explain. A woman sat in a restaurant across from her partner. They were discussing something entirely ordinary, but she was barely listening. She felt tension rising within her. The man glanced at a waitress and smiled briefly. Nothing more. Yet immediately fear appeared inside her, jealousy, anger, shame about her own emotions. For years she had considered herself calm and above such things, but the shadow was now emerging. It was never about the waitress. It was about an old belief hidden deep inside her. I am not enough. Everyone eventually leaves. The shadow often wears the face of the child we once were, a frightened child, an abandoned child, a shamed child, a child who was never heard. An adult may have a successful career, confidence and an orderly life, yet still react from the wounds of the past. That is why certain situations trigger emotions so intense that they seem disproportionate. The present is not what hurts most. It is the past suddenly coming alive. The man left his apartment and wandered through empty streets for a long time. It was a cold morning. The city was only beginning to wake. People hurried to work carrying cups of coffee. Each one carried an invisible burden. Suddenly a simple but painful realization struck him. He had spent his whole life trying to be a good person, yet he had never allowed himself to see his own darkness. A person who represses their shadow becomes its servant. That is why the most moral people can be cruel to themselves and others. That is why suppressed aggression turns into passive hostility. That is why unexpressed sorrow becomes emotional coldness. The shadow does not disappear through positive thinking. It requires awareness. It requires a seat at the table. Jung believed that a person becomes whole not by eliminating darkness, but by integrating it. It is one of life's most difficult tasks. To admit to oneself, yes, jealousy exists within me. Yes, anger exists within me. Yes, I can be selfish. Yes, sometimes I am so afraid that I run from my own life. Such truth hurts. Yet, paradoxically, it is exactly what brings freedom. A person no longer has to pretend to be flawless, no longer has to build a perfect image. They can become real. That evening, the woman returned to her empty apartment. She did not switch on the lights immediately. She sat on the floor in the darkness and felt exhausted from constantly hiding her emotions. Throughout her life, she had wanted to be good, strong, and reasonable. Yet beneath all of that lived loneliness, anger, fear of being unimportant. And for the first time, she did not push those feelings away. She allowed them to exist. It felt strangely peaceful, as though after years of struggle she had stopped forcing parts of herself beyond the borders of awareness. The shadow becomes dangerous only when it remains unseen. The greatest evil is born not from conscious darkness, but from repressed darkness. A person who knows their own anger is less likely to be controlled by it. A person who knows their own fear no longer needs to pretend courage. A person who can look at their own jealousy without self-hatred begins to understand their unmet needs. Meeting the shadow is painful because it destroys the illusion of who we wanted to be. Yet only then does true intimacy become possible, with others and with ourselves. Only a person who has accepted their own darkness can stop fearing the darkness of others. Rain began striking the apartment windows. The woman closed her eyes. There was still much pain inside her, many questions. But beneath all of it, something new had appeared, a delicate sense of wholeness, as if all the rejected parts of herself were slowly returning home. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Perhaps that is why the path back to oneself never leads only through peace and beauty. Sometimes it leads through late-night conversations with one's own shadow. Through tears a person has been ashamed of for a lifetime, through truths that at first seemed too heavy to bear, yet beneath that truth lies something profoundly human. Not perfection, not spiritual purity, but wholeness, and wholeness always contains both light and darkness. Most people never truly live. They exist somewhere between memory and expectation, suspended between what has already been and what is yet to come. A person tells themselves, just this month, just a little more work. once I lose weight, once I earn more, once I meet the right person. And so they spend an entire lifetime postponing themselves, as though real existence will begin only when every problem disappears. But problems never disappear completely, they merely change shape. Meanwhile, life happens only now. That is why so many people wake up one day with the painful feeling that they have missed their own lives, even though they were physically present the whole time. A man sat on a train moving through the grey outskirts of a city. Apartment blocks, warehouses, wet streets, and people waiting at bus stops with their faces buried in scarves drifted past the window. He watched them and felt as though everyone was constantly running somewhere, as if there were an invisible point in the future that had to be reached before relief could finally arrive. But when a person reaches that point, the relief lasts only a moment. Soon another goal appears, another just one more thing, another later. Ego feeds on the future because the future offers the illusion of control. If a person believes happiness is waiting somewhere ahead, they can avoid confronting the emptiness of the present moment. That is why so many people cannot sit quietly even for a few minutes. Presence begins revealing everything they have spent years escaping. Viktor Frankl wrote that a person can endure almost any how if they know their why. The problem is that modern life has deprived many people of contact with genuine meaning. It has left them chasing something endlessly, something they can no longer even name. A woman was returning home from work late in the evening. The tram was almost empty. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, tired, motionless, absent. Suddenly she remembered herself from 10 years earlier. Back then she had so many dreams. She believed that once she achieved stability, she would be happy. Once she found love, she would finally breathe freely. Once everything fell into place, she would truly begin living. But life never fell into place. It simply kept moving forward, faster and faster, and increasingly she felt like a passenger in her own existence. People often treat the present moment as an obstacle, standing between them and the future. They fail to notice mornings. They do not taste their food. They do not hear their own breathing. Even during conversations, they are already thinking about what comes next. The mind constantly races forward or returns to the past because the present is uncomfortable for ego. In the present, there is no room to construct an illusion of oneself. There is only the raw experience of being alive. Eckhart Tolle wrote that most human suffering comes from psychological time. People carry the weight of the past and the fear of the future, and in doing so, lose the only moment that truly exists. That is why even beautiful experiences pass unnoticed. People photograph sunsets but rarely look at them. They sit across from someone they love while their minds are elsewhere. They walk through forests while analyzing emails or rehearsing fears. They live at a constant distance from the present moment. The man stepped off the train and began walking without any destination. The air was cold and damp with approaching rain. He passed a grocery store, a small flower shop, and an elderly woman standing outside a bakery. She held a paper bag filled with bread and stood completely still for a moment, gazing up at the sky. There was something extraordinary about it. No hurry, no tension, only presence. A sudden sadness pierced him because he realized how long it had been since he had truly experienced an ordinary moment. Modern people often treat life as a project, requiring constant improvement. Yet life is not a project. It is not a checklist. It is not a road leading toward a perfect version of oneself. Life is something far more fragile and subtle. It is the moment already passing by. A breath. Light entering through a window at dawn. The touch of a hand. The silence following a difficult conversation. The problem is that people usually learn to appreciate life only when they begin losing it. Irvin Yalom wrote that awareness of death awakens people to life. Only when someone truly understands that everything is temporary do they begin to see clearly. Every moment becomes delicate and irreplaceable, yet most people live as though they possess endless time. They postpone conversations, they postpone love, they postpone rest, they postpone themselves. The woman entered her empty apartment. She took off her coat and sat by the window. Beyond the glass, the city glowed with thousands of lights. Suddenly, she remembered a moment from childhood. She was perhaps 9 years old, lying on grass during summer and watching clouds drift across the sky. She was not hurrying anywhere. Time felt enormous. The world felt simple. A wave of emotion rose inside her because she realized that somewhere along the way she had lost the ability to inhabit a moment fully. Adulthood had taught her to live in constant tension toward the future, as though peace had to be earned first. Yet peace does not exist in the future. It exists only here. People fear the present because the present exposes the truth. If you are lonely, you will feel loneliness. If you are exhausted, you will feel exhaustion. If you are living someone else's life, the present moment will begin revealing it. That is why the mind endlessly creates new goals and new stories. Anything to avoid being alone with what already is. Thich Nhat Hanh said that the true miracle is being completely present for the moment you are living right now. It sounds simple, yet for many people it is almost impossible. Presence requires stopping, and stopping requires courage. The man walked through the city streets deep into the night. At some point, rain began to fall. People hurried beneath awnings and umbrellas. He continued walking slowly. Raindrops ran down his face. He could hear his own breathing. Suddenly, the world seemed astonishingly clear. Streetlights reflected in the wet asphalt. The air smelled of winter. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughed, and for the first time in a very long while, he was not trying to be anywhere other than here. The experience was almost painful in its simplicity. No great revelation, no spiritual ecstasy, only a moment of complete presence. Yet in such moments, a person begins to understand something fundamental. Life will not happen later. It is happening now, or it is not happening at all. Everything truly important exists only in the present. Love exists now. Breath exists now. Silence exists now. Even suffering always happens now. The past is a memory. The future is an imagination. Most people spend their lives chasing a moment that never arrives because they fail to notice that they are searching for life everywhere except the one place where it can be found. The rain stopped. The man paused on a bridge and looked down at the dark water flowing beneath him. A strange peace came over him, not because he had solved all his problems, not because he suddenly understood the meaning of existence, simply because for a brief moment he stopped running from the present. And perhaps that is the beginning of awakening. Not finding every answer, but learning to fully inhabit one's own life before it is too late. There are moments when the world suddenly slows down, not because reality changes, but because a person, for a brief instant, stops resisting it. The experience is subtle, so subtle that it is easy to miss. It may happen while watching the flame of a candle, while listening to rain tapping against a windowsill, in the brief silence after an honest conversation, or when someone sits alone before dawn and for the first time in a very long while truly feels their own breath. Presence is not an idea. It is not a philosophy. It is not a spiritual theory. It is the experience of being completely here. Without escaping into the past, without projecting oneself into the future, without the mind endlessly commenting on reality, most people never experience complete presence because their entire lives resemble an uninterrupted internal dialogue. The mind endlessly interprets the world, judges, compares, creates stories. Even when something beautiful happens, people are rarely truly there for it. Instead of experiencing the moment, they immediately begin thinking about it. A woman sat in a small wooden cabin among the mountains. She had come there alone after months of growing exhaustion. She was not searching for enlightenment. She was not trying to find herself. She simply wanted for a little while not to hear the world. The first days were difficult. The silence felt too large, too unsettling. In the evenings, she automatically reached for her phone, even though there was no signal. Her mind desperately tried to return to noise. But with each passing day, something began to change. In the morning, she was awakened by the wind moving through the branches. She drank tea while sitting by the window, watching mist drift slowly between the mountains. She began noticing things that had once been invisible, the way sunlight moved across the floor, the sound of her own footsteps, the pulse of life hidden within ordinary moments. Eckhart Tolle wrote that presence is a state in which attention fully meets the present moment. Yet most people hear such words and immediately try to turn presence into another goal to achieve. But presence cannot be acquired. It cannot be manufactured through effort. It appears when a person stops clinging so tightly to their own mind. It is much like water in a lake. When the surface is disturbed, the depths cannot be seen. Only when the waves become still does clarity emerge. Modern people live in a state of permanent distraction. Their attention is constantly being torn apart. Screens, messages, advertisements, fears, memories, expectations. The mind never truly rests. Yet attention is the most precious form of presence a person can offer to another human being or to themselves. That is why so many relationships feel empty today. People listen to one another only partially. They sit beside each other, but their awareness is elsewhere. Presence has become something rare. One morning the woman went for a walk. The path led through a damp forest scented with earth and rain. She walked slowly, without purpose, without music, without any need to document the experience. And then something remarkably simple happened. For a moment, the inner narrator disappeared. The voice that constantly comments on everything fell silent. Only the forest remained. The breath, the cool air against her skin, her footsteps on the wet ground. There was no longer any separation between herself and the moment, only the pure experience of being alive. It lasted perhaps a few seconds. Then the mind returned. But something had shifted. Most people live as though they stand one step away from their own experience. They observe themselves, analyze themselves, judge themselves. Presence, however, requires stepping completely into life, without distance, without constant control. That is why it can feel so frightening. In complete presence, there is nowhere to hide behind thoughts. Everything appears. Pain, wonder, loneliness, gratitude, fear, love. Life becomes intensely real. Thich Nhat Hanh believed that the deepest spiritual practice is simply breathing consciously. That sounds ordinary until someone truly attempts to remain present for a single complete breath. Most people cannot stay fully here even for a minute. The mind immediately escapes. That alone reveals how far modern people have drifted from life itself. A man sat beside an open window late at night. The city was quiet. Somewhere in the distance a car passed. He listened to his breathing and suddenly felt something he could not name. It was not euphoria. It was more like a deep peace, as though for a moment the entire weight of psychological time had fallen away. He no longer had to prove anything. He no longer had to become someone else. He no longer had to know what would happen next. There was only this moment, simple, sufficient. People often search for great spiritual experiences because they fail to recognize the sacredness of ordinary existence. Yet presence is not a withdrawal from life. It is the fullest possible entry into life, into the taste of tea, into the silence of morning, into the trembling of one's own heart during a difficult conversation, into the gaze of another human being. That is why some people, after years of chasing more, suddenly discover that the most important moments of their lives were astonishingly simple. A walk with someone they loved, the smell of a childhood home, the laughter of a child in another room, light streaming through a window on a winter morning. Presence does not require spectacle, it requires attention. Alan Watts wrote that a person is like someone so focused on reaching the destination that they forget to listen to the music along the way. Modern culture has created a permanent hunger for more success, more experiences, more stimulation. Yet the human soul rarely suffers from having too little. More often it suffers from never fully receiving what is already here. A person can spend an entire lifetime searching for extraordinary experiences while overlooking the miracle hidden within ordinary existence. Presence teaches something that the mind resists. This moment is enough, not because it is perfect, not because it contains no pain, but because it is alive. The woman returned to the cabin as evening settled over the mountains. She lit a candle and sat quietly by the window. Darkness slowly filled the valley. The trees swayed gently in the wind. Nothing extraordinary happened, no revelation, No vision, no final answer, yet she felt closer to life than she had in years. For the first time she understood that presence is not something added to existence. Presence is what remains when all unnecessary noise falls away. Beneath ambition, beneath fear, beneath endless striving, there is simply this moment, breathing, existing, being, and perhaps that is where the deepest peace has always been waiting. If you recognize a part of your own story in these words, leave a comment and tell us what resonated with you the most. Subscribe to the channel to return for more reflections and audiobooks. And if you'd like to support the creation of content like this, take a look at the links in the description. Thank you. Now let's return to our shared journey. Most people do not fall in love with another human being. They fall in love with the way that person allows them, for a little while, not to feel their own loneliness. It is a brutal truth that few are willing to touch. Very often, people enter relationships not to truly meet another person, but to escape themselves. They search for someone who will quiet their fear, fill their emptiness, confirm their worth, and drown out the silence. That is why so many relationships begin with intensity and end in disappointment. Not because love dies, often because it was never truly there. There were only two lonely egos trying to use one another as shelter from their own pain. The woman met him in autumn. A fine rain was falling, and the city smelled of wet leaves and cold air. They met by chance in a small bookstore hidden between a cafe and an old cinema. They talked for several hours. About books, childhood, music, and the fear of passing time. Around him she felt something she had not experienced for a long time, being seen, as if someone was looking deeper than her words and smiles. It was almost dangerous in its intensity. What people long for most is not perfect love, but the possibility of being completely themselves with another human being. A place where there is no need to perform, no need to earn acceptance, no need to hide one's inner chaos. She had spent years believing that love meant finding someone who would finally remove her pain, someone who would heal the wounds she carried from childhood, someone who would make her feel complete. But no human being can do that. The burden is too great, the expectation too impossible. Real love begins where rescue ends. It begins when two people stop demanding salvation from one another and start meeting each other as they truly are. The man felt the same fear. Although he rarely admitted it, he carried a deep terror of being abandoned. Whenever someone came too close, part of him wanted to run. Whenever someone moved away, panic arose inside him. For years he thought the problem lay with other people, that he simply had not met the right person. Only later did he realize that the conflict lived within him. He longed for intimacy and feared it at the same time. Many people call this love, yet often it is merely the collision of old wounds. Two people meet and awaken each other's hidden fears. One fears abandonment, the other fears being trapped. One clings tighter, the other withdraws. Both believe the other person is causing the pain. In reality, the pain was already there long before the relationship began. The relationship merely revealed it. Carl Jung once wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The same is true in love. Relationships become mirrors. They show us not only our tenderness and beauty, but also our fears, insecurities, and unconscious patterns. That is why intimacy can feel so terrifying. To be truly loved means to be seen. Not only the parts we proudly display, but also the parts we hide. The woman noticed that as the months passed, something was changing between them. The initial intensity softened. The excitement remained, but it was no longer fueled by fantasy. It was becoming something quieter, more real. She began to see his flaws, his moments of insecurity, his impatience, his sadness, and he saw hers as well. There were days when neither looked particularly impressive, days when both felt tired, irritated, uncertain. Yet strangely, this made them closer rather than farther apart. Because for the first time, neither was trying to maintain a perfect image. Most people spend enormous amounts of energy protecting a version of themselves they want others to see. They hide their fears. They conceal their vulnerability. They pretend to be stronger, happier, calmer, or more confident than they truly are. But masks may attract attention. They cannot create intimacy. Only truth can do that. Real love is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to remain present despite fear. It is the courage to say, "This is who I am." Not the polished version, not the idealized version. The real one, the frightened one, the imperfect one, the human one. One evening they sat together in silence. Rain tapped gently against the windows. No one felt the need to fill the room with words. There was no performance, no attempt to impress, no struggle to be enough. And in that simple silence, both felt something rare. Safety. Not because all wounds had healed, not because all fears had disappeared, but because neither was hiding anymore. Perhaps that is what love truly is. Not finding someone who completes us, not finding someone who saves us, but finding someone with whom we no longer need to run from ourselves. Love without a mask begins when presence becomes more important than performance. When truth becomes more important than approval. When two people stop asking, "Will you make me whole?" and begin asking, "Can we be real together?" And perhaps that is the deepest intimacy a human being can ever know. People spend much of their lives holding on to relationships that have already ended, to identities that no longer fit, to dreams that have lost their meaning, to pain that has become familiar. Letting go sounds simple, yet it is one of the most difficult things a human being can do, because what we release is rarely only the thing itself. We release the story we built around it. The woman sat alone in her apartment after the relationship had ended. The room looked exactly the same as before. The same furniture, the same books, the same photographs on the shelves. Yet everything felt different. There was an absence in the air, as though part of the world had quietly disappeared. At first, she resisted it. She replayed conversations in her mind, wondered what she could have said differently, imagined alternative endings. Her thoughts moved in circles, always returning to the same place. But grief does not listen to logic. It moves at its own pace, like a tide, like weather, like seasons. People often believe suffering comes from loss itself, yet much of suffering comes from refusing to accept that the loss has already happened. The mind keeps negotiating with reality. This should not have happened. It should have lasted longer. Things were supposed to be different, but reality remains unmoved. It asks only one thing, that we see what is. The man experienced something similar after the death of his father. For months he fought against the fact that the world had changed. Every memory felt like a wound. Every familiar place carried an ache. He wanted the pain to disappear, wanted life to return to what it had been before. But one day he realized something quietly devastating. There was no returning. The person he had been no longer existed. The life he had known no longer existed. And perhaps that was not a tragedy, perhaps it was simply life. Everything changes, everything passes, every relationship, every season, every certainty, even the version of ourselves we cling to most desperately. Buddhist teachings often speak of impermanence, not as a punishment, but as a truth. A difficult truth, certainly, yet also a liberating one. Because when we stop demanding permanence from a changing world, we suffer less. The woman walked through a park one autumn afternoon. Leaves covered the paths in shades of gold and rust. A cold wind moved through the trees. She watched a single leaf detach from a branch and drift slowly toward the ground. There was no resistance in it, no struggle, no attempt to remain attached to what could not be held. For a brief moment she envied that leaf. Human beings cling because they fear emptiness. They fear that if they let go, nothing will remain. Yet again and again, life teaches the opposite lesson. Something always remains, not what we expected, not what we planned, but something deeper. After every ending, there is still breath, still sky, still morning light entering through a window, still the possibility of being alive. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote that we must trust what is difficult. Growth rarely arrives through certainty. More often, it arrives through loss, through endings, through moments when life removes what we believed we could not live without. Not because life is cruel, but because it is constantly inviting us into a deeper relationship with reality. The woman returned home before sunset. She sat quietly by the window and watched darkness settle over the city. The sadness had not disappeared. The longing remained. Yet something else had appeared beside it. Space. A quiet openness. As if by releasing her grip on what was gone, she had created room for life to enter again. Letting go does not mean forgetting. It does not mean ceasing to love. It does not mean pretending something never mattered. It means allowing reality to be what it is. It means carrying memories without being imprisoned by them. It means loving what was while still saying yes to what is. And perhaps that is one of the deepest forms of courage. Not holding on forever, but opening one's hands when the time comes, trusting that life continues to flow even after what we loved has passed through them. Human beings crave certainty. They want to know what will happen tomorrow, next month, next year. They want guarantees that love will last, that their health will remain intact, that the people they care about will stay, that their plans will succeed. Yet life offers no such promises. From the very beginning, existence is woven from uncertainty. Still, most people spend enormous amounts of energy trying to control what cannot be controlled. A man sat at his desk late at night, staring at a list of tasks. Every detail of his life was carefully organized. His calendar was full. His goals were defined. His future was mapped out with precision. Yet beneath all that order lived anxiety. The more he tried to control life, the more fragile he felt. Because reality refused to obey his plans, unexpected events kept appearing. People changed. Circumstances shifted. The future remained stubbornly unknown. Control often disguises itself as responsibility. Sometimes it even looks like wisdom. But beneath it, there is frequently something simpler. Fear. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of disappointment. Fear of pain. A person tells themselves that if they prepare enough, think enough, analyze enough, they will finally feel safe. Yet safety built upon control is always unstable. Reality is too vast to fit inside human plans. The woman experienced this truth after losing a job she believed would define her future. For years she had built her identity around that work. She imagined where it would lead. She imagined the life it would create. Then suddenly it was gone. At first she felt panic. The future she had carefully constructed collapsed in front of her. Questions flooded her mind. What now? What if I fail? What if nothing better comes? But beneath those fears, another realization slowly emerged. The future she had imagined had never truly existed. It had only been a story. Human beings suffer not only because reality changes, they suffer because they become attached to the pictures they create of how reality should unfold. They mourn futures that never happened. They grieve possibilities that existed only in imagination. They cling to expectations as if they were facts. Yet life rarely follows the script written by the mind. Alan Watts often pointed out that trying to secure oneself completely is like trying to hold water in a clenched fist. The tighter the grip becomes, the more quickly everything slips away. Control creates tension. Presence creates openness. One evening the man walked through the city during a storm. Rain fell heavily. Wind pushed against his coat. People hurried for shelter. For a moment he stopped beneath a street lamp and simply stood there. Water ran down his face. The weather did not care about his plans. The storm did not ask for permission. It simply existed. And strangely he felt relief. The world was moving according to its own rhythm, not his. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel responsible for controlling everything. Many people carry burdens that were never theirs to carry. They try to control other people's emotions, other people's choices, the outcome of every situation. Yet true maturity is not learning how to control more. It is learning what cannot be controlled at all. We cannot control whether someone loves us. We cannot control whether people understand us. We cannot control the passage of time. We cannot control loss. We cannot control death, and perhaps accepting these truths is one of the most painful forms of wisdom, but it is also one of the most liberating. The woman sat by a river one afternoon. The water flowed steadily past her. It never paused, never looked back, never tried to return to where it had been. She watched the current and understood something simple. Life is movement. The suffering came not from the river flowing, but from her insistence that it should stand still. The need for control often comes from the belief that uncertainty is the enemy. Yet uncertainty is also where possibility lives. Every friendship begins there. Every love story, every transformation, every unexpected joy. If everything were known in advance, life would lose its mystery. It would lose its depth. It would lose its aliveness. The sun was setting when she stood and began walking home. Nothing about her circumstances had changed. The future was still uncertain. Questions remained unanswered. Yet her heart felt lighter. Not because she had gained control, but because she had stopped demanding it. Sometimes peace does not arrive when life becomes predictable. Sometimes it arrives when a person finally accepts that life never was. And perhaps freedom begins there. Not in mastering reality, but in learning to move with it. Like water, like wind, like breath itself. Every human being knows somewhere deep inside that their time is limited. Yet most people spend their lives trying not to think about it. They fill their days with obligations, distractions, ambitions, and noise. Not because these things are meaningless, but because silence sometimes reveals a truth the mind would rather avoid. One day, everything will end. The body will grow old. The people we love will leave or be taken away. The familiar world will change beyond recognition. And eventually we too will disappear. The man first felt this truth after attending a funeral. He stood among strangers dressed in black. The sky was grey. Cold wind moved through the trees. People spoke softly, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. Looking at the coffin, he felt a strange mixture of sadness and disbelief. The world continued exactly as before. Cars passed in the distance, birds sang, clouds drifted across the sky. Yet for one person, everything had ended. For days afterward, he could not stop thinking about it. Not only about death itself, but about the way people live. How easily they assume there will always be more time, more opportunities, more conversations, more tomorrows. Yet none of those things are guaranteed. Death is the one certainty shared by every human being, and perhaps that is precisely why so many spend their lives avoiding it. Ernest Becker argued that much of human behavior is shaped by the fear of mortality. People seek achievement, recognition, power, and legacy, partly because they hope, consciously or unconsciously, to escape the feeling of impermanence. They want something of themselves to remain, something that will outlast the fragile body. Yet no achievement can completely remove the truth of mortality. The woman thought about death one evening while sitting alone on her balcony. The city lights flickered in the darkness. Somewhere nearby, laughter drifted through an open window. She remembered her grandmother, who had died years earlier. For a long time, she had associated death only with loss, only with pain. But now she began seeing something else. Without death, life would lose its urgency. Without endings, beginnings would have little meaning. It is because moments pass that they become precious. A sunset matters because it fades. A conversation matters because it cannot be repeated exactly. A human life matters because it is finite. Viktor Frankl wrote that life's transience does not destroy its meaning but creates it. Every moment becomes valuable precisely because it cannot be kept forever. Yet many people live as though they have an unlimited supply of time. They postpone what matters most. They delay forgiveness. They delay love. They delay honesty. They delay living, always waiting for the perfect moment. But the perfect moment rarely arrives. The man visited his father's grave one afternoon. The wind moved gently through the cemetery. Green grass covered the earth. For a long while he sat in silence. He thought about all the things they had never said to one another, all the conversations they believed could happen later. Some of them never did. At first, this realization filled him with regret. Then something shifted. Instead of becoming a source of despair, the awareness became an invitation, a reminder not to postpone what mattered now. Death has a strange way of clarifying life. It strips away many of the things that seem important during ordinary days. Status, comparisons, endless worries about what others think. In the face of mortality, such concerns often lose their power. What remains are simpler questions. Did I love? Did I live honestly? Was I present for the life I was given? Did I allow myself to truly experience being alive? The woman watched the stars appear above the city. For the first time in a long while, thoughts of death did not make her feel smaller. They made her feel more awake, more attentive, more grateful. The fragility of existence suddenly seemed inseparable from its beauty. Every breath was temporary, every season, every relationship, every heartbeat, and because of that, each carried a quiet kind of sacredness. Thich Nhat Hanh often spoke of the way a cloud never truly dies. It changes form. It becomes rain, a river, mist, something else. Perhaps human beings, too, are more connected to life than they realize. Perhaps death is not only an ending, but also a return to a mystery larger than understanding. The man stood and began walking home. The evening air was cool. The city around him looked ordinary, yet everything seemed slightly more vivid. The lights, the sounds, the people passing by. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had changed, because for a brief moment he remembered something most people forget. Life is not waiting somewhere ahead. It is happening now. And the fact that it will not last forever is not a reason for despair. It is a reason to be fully here while it does. Human beings often see impermanence as an enemy. They suffer because things change, because youth fades, because relationships evolve, because certainty disappears, because everything they love eventually transforms. Yet perhaps the deepest misunderstanding lies here. Impermanence is not what steals life from us. Impermanence is what gives life its value. Imagine a flower that never withers, a sunset that never ends, a song that continues forever without pause. Eventually, beauty would become invisible. Wonder would disappear. It is precisely because things pass that they matter. The woman sat in a park during early spring. The trees were beginning to bloom. Small green leaves appeared where only weeks earlier there had been bare branches. Children played nearby. A dog chased a ball across the grass. Everything seemed alive with movement. Yet she noticed something she had overlooked for most of her life. Nothing remained the same for even a moment. The clouds moved, the light shifted, the wind changed direction. Even her own thoughts rose and vanished like waves. And suddenly she understood that change was not happening to life. Change was life. For years she had believed happiness meant creating something permanent, a permanent relationship, permanent security, permanent peace. But permanence was nowhere to be found. The more tightly she tried to hold things in place, the more suffering she created. Because reality continued moving. Seasons changed, people changed, she changed. Her pain came not from movement itself, but from resistance to movement. The man remembered an old photograph of himself taken many years earlier. He had been younger then. Different dreams, different fears, different beliefs, different... Looking at the image, he felt a strange tenderness. At the time, he had been convinced he would always remain that person. Yet that version of himself had vanished long ago, not through tragedy, through life. And in truth, countless versions of him had already disappeared. The child, the teenager, the young man. Each had arrived and departed like seasons. Yet something remained beneath all those changes. A quiet awareness watching the river flow. Buddhist teachings often compare life to a stream. Water never remains the same, yet the river continues. Human beings suffer because they try to freeze the current. They demand that people remain unchanged, that circumstances remain favorable, that emotions remain pleasant. But existence offers no such guarantee. Every experience is temporary. Joy comes and goes. Sadness comes and goes. Success comes and goes. Failure comes and goes. Even suffering is impermanent. This truth can feel frightening at first, yet hidden within it is enormous freedom. If everything changes, then pain changes too. No feeling lasts forever. No darkness remains forever. The woman had once believed her grief would never end. After losing someone she loved, she felt as though the world had permanently lost its color. Yet months passed, then years. The grief did not disappear, but it changed shape. It softened. It became woven into her life rather than standing against it. What once felt unbearable slowly became part of her humanity. Impermanence had not erased the loss. It had transformed her relationship to it. One evening she watched rain slide down her window. The drops merged, separated, disappeared. There was something strangely comforting in their movement. For the first time she saw that life was not asking her to hold on forever. It was asking her to participate, to experience, to love fully while things were here, and to release them when they were gone. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote that beauty and terror belong together. Everything beautiful carries the possibility of loss. Everything precious carries fragility within it. Yet perhaps fragility is not a flaw. Perhaps it is what makes tenderness possible. A person who knows something is temporary, pays closer attention, loves more deeply, listens more carefully, appreciates more fully. The man walked through the city at dusk. The sky glowed with the last light of day. He watched people hurrying home, each carrying invisible hopes and fears. Some were beginning new chapters, others were ending old ones. Some were falling in love, some were saying goodbye. The entire city seemed like a vast landscape of beginnings and endings happening simultaneously, and suddenly he felt an unexpected peace. Nothing needed to stay forever. Nothing needed to be preserved exactly as it was. Life had never asked that of him. It only asked him to be present for what was here now, to receive each moment fully before it passed. The sun disappeared below the horizon. Darkness spread slowly across the streets, yet even that felt beautiful, not despite its ending, but because of it. And perhaps that is the hidden gift of impermanence. It teaches a person not merely how to let go, it teaches them how to love. Because only when we understand that everything changes do we finally begin to cherish what is here. There comes a moment when a person grows tired of fighting, not because they have become weak, not because they have given up, but because they finally understand that some battles were never meant to be won. For years they struggled against reality, against pain, against uncertainty, against themselves. Yet every victory felt temporary, and every attempt to control life created new tension. Eventually, exhaustion became a teacher. The woman sat beside a lake on a quiet afternoon. The water was still. The surface reflected clouds drifting slowly across the sky. She had come there after one of the most difficult periods of her life. Plans had fallen apart. Relationships had changed. Certainties she once depended on no longer existed. For a long time she interpreted these events as failures. She believed life had betrayed her. But sitting beside the water, she began to see things differently. Perhaps life had not been breaking her. Perhaps it had been removing what no longer belonged. Human beings often imagine surrender as defeat. The word itself sounds passive. It suggests weakness. Yet true surrender is not resignation. It is the willingness to stop arguing with reality. It is the courage to say yes to what already exists instead of endlessly demanding that it become something else. The man spent years trying to force life into a shape that matched his expectations. He believed happiness depended on specific outcomes, specific people, specific achievements. Whenever reality moved in a different direction, he resisted. He became frustrated, anxious, angry, yet no amount of resistance changed the facts. The future remained uncertain. People remained unpredictable. Life remained larger than his plans. One evening he sat alone in his apartment. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Questions still filled his mind. There were things he did not understand. Wounds that had not completely healed. Dreams that had not come true. Yet for the first time, he stopped demanding answers. He allowed uncertainty to exist, and something remarkable happened. Beneath the anxiety, he discovered a quiet stillness. A peace that did not depend on having everything figured out. Much of human suffering comes from the belief that life should be different from what it is. A person says, "This should not have happened." I should not feel this way. My story should look different. Yet reality remains unchanged by these protests. The conflict exists only within the mind. Acceptance does not mean approval. It does not mean enjoying pain or welcoming loss. It simply means seeing clearly, seeing what is actually here instead of endlessly comparing it to what could have been. The woman watched a leaf drift across the surface of the lake. It moved effortlessly with the current. It did not struggle against the water. It did not demand a different destination. It simply moved with life. For a moment, she felt something she had not experienced in years. Trust, not certainty. Not confidence that everything would work out exactly as she wanted. Something deeper. A trust that she could meet whatever came. Many people spend their lives waiting to feel safe before they begin living. Yet complete safety never arrives. The future remains unknown. The heart remains vulnerable. Loss remains possible. Love remains risky. Life asks for participation without guarantees. And perhaps surrender is the moment a person finally accepts that invitation. Alan Watts once suggested that life is more like music than a journey. The point of music is not to reach the final note as quickly as possible. The point is to experience the music while it plays. Yet many people live as though they are rushing towards some future conclusion where everything will finally make sense. They forget that life is happening now. The man walked through the city late that night. The streets were quiet. Lights glowed behind apartment windows. Somewhere a train moved through the darkness. Everything appeared ordinary. Yet he felt different. Nothing external had changed. The world remained uncertain. Problems remained unresolved. Questions remained unanswered. But something inside him had relaxed. He no longer felt responsible for forcing reality into a particular shape. He no longer needed to carry the impossible burden of controlling life. The stars appeared between drifting clouds. He stopped for a moment and looked upward. The universe felt vast beyond comprehension. Entire galaxies moved through space without asking for permission. Seasons changed. Oceans rose and fell. Life unfolded according to rhythms older than human understanding. And suddenly he felt small in the most liberating way. Not insignificant, connected, part of something larger than his fears, part of a mystery that did not require solving. Surrender is not the end of the journey. It is the end of unnecessary struggle. It is the moment a person stops standing against the river and allows themselves to move with it, not passively, not helplessly, but consciously, openly, fully alive. And perhaps that is what wisdom ultimately becomes, not knowing everything, not controlling everything, but trusting life enough to meet it exactly as it is. There are no fanfares, no great light splitting the sky, no moment when a person wakes up in the morning and suddenly every wound is healed, every question is answered, and life becomes simple. Such endings exist in stories, but not in real life. True awakening is quiet, so quiet that it is easy to miss. It arrives not as an explosion, but as the gradual lifting of a burden a person has carried for so long that they forgot it was possible to live differently. Returning to yourself is not an achievement. It is a remembrance, not the acquisition of something new, but the rediscovery of what was never truly lost. The man sat by an open window at dawn. Spring had arrived earlier than usual. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh leaves. The city was only beginning to wake. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Someone opened a window. Someone else was already hurrying to work. The world looked exactly as it had thousands of times before, yet something was different, not outside, within him. For a long time he had searched for answers. He had read books, analyzed his own psychology, tried to understand the meaning of suffering, loneliness, love, and mortality. He believed there was some point he needed to reach, some final truth, some ultimate healing. But now he was beginning to understand that life is not a puzzle to be solved. It is an experience to be lived. Human beings spend much of their lives fighting reality. They want things to be different. They do not want pain. They do not want people to change. They want love to last forever. They want the body never to age. They want the future to be certain. But life does not negotiate. It moves according to its own rhythm. When a person stops fighting that rhythm, it does not mean surrendering in defeat. It means entering into a deeper agreement with what is. The woman walked through a park beneath sunlight, filtering through the branches of trees. Everything seemed ordinary, yet she felt moved, not because something extraordinary had happened, precisely because nothing had happened. For years, she had searched for great moments that would give life meaning. Yet meaning had been hiding in the simplest places, in breath, in presence, in the ability to be completely where she was. People often imagine spiritual growth as climbing higher and higher. But perhaps the truth is the opposite. Perhaps it is about descending deeper and deeper, closer to oneself, closer to life as it actually is, without decoration, without illusion, without the endless need to become someone else. Carl Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Those words sound different after a person has passed through their own darkness. It is no longer about constructing an ideal self. It becomes about having the courage to be real, to accept imperfection, light and shadow, strength and fragility. All the parts of oneself that once seemed unacceptable. The man visited his father's grave late one afternoon. Months had passed since his death. The trees around the cemetery were green. Wind moved gently through the branches. He sat on a bench and remained silent for a long time. The pain no longer felt the same. The sadness remained, but its shape had changed. It had become softer, more human, as though over time he had learned to live beside it rather than fight it. That is one of the most important lessons life teaches. Not everything can be fixed. Not everything needs to be fixed. Some experiences never disappear. They become part of the landscape of the heart. Viktor Frankl wrote that a person can find meaning, even in suffering, if they do not allow it to rob them of their human depth. That does not mean pain is good. It means that even the most painful experiences can open doors to greater awareness, greater tenderness toward life, greater presence. The woman sat on her balcony as evening slowly darkened the sky. Lights appeared in the windows of nearby buildings. She thought about every stage of her journey, the loneliness she had once feared, the shadow she had run from, the fear of loss, the endless search for herself. And suddenly she saw that all of those experiences had been leading to the same place. Not perfection, not enlightenment, presence. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote that the true home is found in the present moment. People spend their lives searching for home in relationships, achievements, ideas, and dreams. Yet the deepest home is a state of awareness, a place where one stops running from oneself, a place where one can simply be, without a mask, without pressure, without the constant judgment of one's own existence. The modern world tells people they should always become more productive, more attractive, more developed, more exceptional. But perhaps the deepest wisdom says something entirely different. Perhaps nothing essential is missing. Perhaps beneath all the striving, all the fear, all the noise, there has always been something whole, something that does not need improvement, something that remains untouched by success and failure, praise and criticism, gain and loss. The night grew darker. The city lights shimmered in the distance. The woman closed her eyes and listened to her breathing. In that moment there was nothing she needed to become, nothing she needed to prove, nothing she needed to chase. There was only life. Simple, present, alive. And perhaps that is what returning to yourself has always meant. Not becoming someone new, but finally allowing yourself to be who you have been all along. If this story touched something important within you, leave a comment and share your reflection. Sometimes a single sentence can become a light for another person. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future audiobooks and journeys into the depths of the self. If you'd like to support the creation of content like this, take a look at the links in the description. Your support helps make more materials filled with silence, presence, and depth possible. Thank you for sharing this journey with us. And now, before you go, pause for a moment. Take a gentle breath. Feel that you are here. Because perhaps everything you have been searching for has been waiting in this very moment all along. Until next time.